Okay, so yeah, last week we were supposed to be doing the United States foreign policy and the influence that the media had, and we would have talked a little bit about various networks and things like that. And as I say, I might upload a sort of video. Today's class is supposed to be on military power, as I suppose, but it is on military power and the United States foreign policy. So that's yeah, that is the topic. I have sent you a little article. You can read that at home, but it was something I found last night um, discussing, um, I suppose, the current state of American military power. I'm just trying to find that. It's not open on my computer. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I'll see if I can find it now. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so yeah, wake up. America's military isn't invincible was the headline. This was from a Washington Post newspaper article, which was published in 2018. As we sit too idly meaning if you're idle, you're not doing anything. As we sit too idly by, Russia, China, and North Korea are racing to modernize their forces. So yeah, as I said, this article appeared, I said December 2018, so about 18 months ago. And essentially, yeah, the main argument of the article is that America's lead in military power was beginning to sort of narrow, that other countries, Russia, China, North Korea, were beginning to sort of catch up with the United States, and it gives various reasons for that. I'm just having a quick skim through. There's a few things I've put in sort of bold. I'll just read a sentence or two from it. This isn't from the third paragraph into the article. Mentions the military plays two essential roles in defending US international goals. The first is to deter aggression that would jeopardize American interests. So that's one important feature of American military power, this idea that military power deters. I think we've had this word in English for politics and administration. We talked about nuclear deterrence. So yeah, to deter somebody by using military power, you basically prevent them from doing something bad against you because they will fear your retaliation. So deterrence, to deter somebody. So the first is to deter aggression that would jeopardize, there's another good word, jeopardize American interests. Jeopardize meaning endanger, risk, because potential adversaries, so adversaries meaning opponents, enemies, believe their chances of prevailing are slim to none. The second is to fight and to win wars to protect those same interests in both cases. In both cases, the United States military is on a downward trajectory. So essentially saying, as I say, that other countries are beginning to close in on the United States in terms of military power. I mean, it kind of discusses various reasons for that. Mentions the Pentagon. Anybody remember what is the Pentagon? Pentagon, that is America's defense department. Okay, so it's the building in Washington which houses the Department of Defense. So it mentions the Pentagon. It says the Pentagon is losing badly. So yeah, this is this is a slightly from the American perspective anyway, this was a slightly alarming article, essentially saying that for a long time the United States has been the world's #1 military superpower, but its lead is being eroded meaning weakened. So other countries, China, Russia, perhaps North Korea, they are catching up with America. So America's position, sometimes we talk about position of primacy being #1. is being eroded. Anyway, as I say, I sent you that. That is an article that's sort of worth reading, and I'll let you do that at home. Okay, for today, we'll probably. Oh, Joanna's. Hello? No? Okay. Well, have I lost the rest of the team now? Yeah. Hello, sorry, I think somebody rang me. Can you hear me again still? Sorry. Yeah, sorry, okay. Yeah, Joanna came in for a call and I don't know what happened there. Okay, fine, and I've lost my PowerPoint again. Okay, I'll try and get that back again. Sorry about this. Okay, I think it's coming back. Okay, yeah, I was talking about American military power. And yeah, the article that I sent you, which, as I say, basically says that America's lead is beginning to slip. Okay, right, good. Let's move on. Yeah, I was also saying, yeah, I'll basically do a quickly go through one or two of the slides. We probably won't use the full 90 minutes because doing it this way, teaching online, it's probably not going to be easy for any of us to sit here just for the full 90 minutes. But I'll try and make most of the main points that I would have done in class. Okay, if anybody wants to ask a question or has any points to make, then just jump in, or if you want me to repeat something or whatever. Okay, so we'll see how we go. Okay, let's move on to the third slide. And I think I've shown you this graph before. It's slightly old, it's 2010, but it very nicely sort of makes the main, whoops, go back again, nicely makes the main, emphasizes the main point when it compares American military spending to the rest of the world. As I say, this was the situation in 2010. And as we can see from this particular graph, the United States spending just short of $700 billion on defense. Then we've got a picture of the rest of the world. The rest of the world basically all sort of piled up on top of each other. You've got China there, which is spending about 120 billion or something like that. Britain 80 or 90, France roughly the same, Russia roughly the same, etc., etc., etc. But combined, all these countries' military spending combined is less than the United States. So on the face of it, America, again, as I say, this is 10 years ago now. I should probably try to find a more up-to-date graph. In fact, I'll try and do that and maybe post that. But at least 10 years ago, America, as I say, was spending pretty much more than the rest of the world combined, or at least more than all the rest of the main big military spenders combined, which kind of illustrates the fact that, first of all, America spends an enormous amount of money on defense. And in terms of expenditure, at least, there is a huge gap between the United States and any of its rivals. Now, it has to be said, as I say, this is 10 years old, and I think there's one or two qualifying things we kind of have to add when looking at this particular graph. First of all, at the time, again, this is 2010, the United States was involved in two sort of major, not wars, but, a lot of military forces were being committed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. The Obama administration was just beginning to start drawing down its forces in Iraq, but there's still quite a big military commitment there. The situation in Afghanistan was obviously still sort of ongoing. So yeah, one of the reasons why so much money was actually being spent on defense was a lot of it was basically going on the sort of US sort of ongoing operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So that was obviously consuming a lot of military resources. The other thing to say, I mean, the article which I sent makes the point that last few years, I mean, during the Obama administration, defense expenditure was being reduced. So, in some ways, I think 2010 was, I'm not sure if it was a peak in the sense it was maximum, but since then, there have certainly been, relatively speaking, there have been sort of reductions in American defense expenditure. America is still, having to devote an awful lot of resources to the situation in Afghanistan. It also has deployments in other parts of the world as well. A final thing I would say, looking at the graph again, I mean, looking at American expenditure in absolute terms, it does look quite impressive. On the other hand, a lot of this money is basically spent on things like salaries, so paying paying soldiers, sailors, airmen, bureaucracy, administration. So a lot of this money just gets consumed not in things like military hardware, weapons or things like that, but is actually, basically spent on just maintaining the American military. Obviously, America it's a developed economy, so the salaries of people in the US military and administrators and all the other sort of personnel costs that are associated with a big organization like that. The salaries are pretty high when compared to somewhere like China or North Korea or Russia. So an awful lot of money gets consumed, as I say, just on the administration and salaries and stuff like that. So that is also something that needs to be sort of borne in mind. How much money is then left over in terms of spending on equipment, weapons, training, research and development, all this other sort of stuff. Probably as a percentage, there's less of that than maybe in other countries because, as I say, a lot of this money just disappears through as I say, salaries and admin and what have you. But even taking that into account, I mean, the general point is that the United States does spend a rather big, has a huge budget. I mean, the defense budget runs into billions and billions and billions of dollars. You compare that to other bits of the other parts of American government spending. America spends much, much, much less on its defense department, on diplomacy and things like that. So US military budget, the defense budget is immense. It's huge. But as I say, there's a sort of debate then as to how much firepower, how much weaponry the America gets in terms of this expenditure. Okay, right, move on to our next slide. I've shown you this before as well, but again, I think it's worth looking at again. Again, slightly old map, but I don't think much has changed in the last few years. US military troops and bases around the world. And I think I've said this before, but it is worth restating. A key difference between the United States and other countries is that it can project its military power globally. This is what separates, historically at least, this is what has separated the United States from other countries. And one of the reasons why the US is able to project power globally is because it has a global network of American military bases. Just looking at the slide here, it says 46 countries with no US military presence. So only a minority of the world's countries, only about a quarter of the world's states, have absolutely no American military presence whatsoever. Then we've got the sort of light pink countries. So that includes countries like Russia, China, India, most of South America, good chunk of Africa. These are countries which do actually have American troops in there. Now, on the face of it, that's quite surprising when you've got Russia and China with US troops inside them. I'm assuming, I haven't actually checked this, but I'm assuming these are soldiers which are in the country for reasons of being military observers, or perhaps checking, inspecting, I should say, inspecting weapons facilities and things like that as part of treaties that America has signed with them. So we're talking, I would imagine in the case of Russia and China, we're talking about a very small number of soldiers, which, as I say, are in these countries for those sorts of reasons. But again, it reflects, if you like, I suppose, the kind of globalized nature of American military interests that, as I say, most of the world's countries, most of the world's countries, I suppose, one way or the other, do actually have some sort of military presence, American military presence in them. Then the countries dark pink, which unsurprisingly include North America, bit of South America, Central America, Western Europe, Scandinavia, bits of the Middle East, Australia. These are countries which have actual American military bases. So these are countries hosting actual American military bases. And again, that kind of reflects, as I say, the sort of globalized nature of America's sort of military reach. Looking at the Middle East, for example, you've got Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, places like that, which are all housing American military bases. And then you've got in Southern Asia, a bit of Central Asia as well, I suppose. You've got 7 countries, it says there, with 13 new US military bases. I say new, but this was probably in the 2000s. But, as a consequence of the war on terror and, the American interventions in Afghanistan, other countries in the region, in the post-Soviet space, if I can put it that way, also, hosted facilities. Okay, right. We'll move on to the next slide. Nobody has any questions or anything. Before we get onto this, I mean, the general point, though, as I say, is American military forces sort of have sort of global reach. And again, you compare America with China, Russia, these sorts of countries, then, as I say, America can kind of project its power in a way that few other countries actually can. That might be changing, again, as the newspaper article which I sent you sort of talks about. Other countries are certainly increasing their capabilities. So it's no longer the case that America is necessarily as dominant in Asia as it once was. China has sort of capabilities now which could probably pose significant problems for the United States military. But nonetheless, as I say, it still has this worldwide network of bases. Okay, right. I'm going to pass over this slide pretty quickly, but it's just talking a little bit about the various military interventions that the United States conducted in the 1990s. What's significant about this table is, as I say, it surveys the 90s, which is the first decade after the Cold War. And the expectation was that this period was going to be pretty peaceful. The Cold War was over. We're supposed to be entering into a new world order, things like that. What this table shows, and I'm not going to go through every single intervention there, but what this table shows was that even in this decade, so this is before the war on terror, before 9/11, things like this, what this table basically shows was that, even in this decade, the American military was still pretty active. So in 1990, you've got an intervention in Liberia to assist in the evacuation of the American embassy. It should be said, looking down the list, a lot of these military deployments were for the purpose of getting American citizens out of various trouble spots. So evacuation US citizens appears a couple of times in this list. But again, as I said, I don't want to go through every single one. But I suppose the two really big interventions. One was 1990 to 91, Operation Desert Fox, which was a major sort of war, sort of United Nations police action, which the United States led to liberate Kuwait. I remember that very well. I was about 16, I think, at the time. Yeah, 15, 16 at the time. And it was, a very, very powerful display of American military power. President George Bush Senior, the first George Bush, assembled this huge sort of international coalition. The United States, obviously, by far the biggest contributor to that coalition, and then conducted a very decisive military campaign against Iraq, which led to the liberation of Kuwait. Iraq figures a couple of times in this list as well, because after Operation Desert Fox, there were various other sorts of interventions as well in this period. Okay, just looking down, a couple of humanitarian interventions: Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, again the evacuation of American citizens, Haiti, Sierra Leone, etc., etc., etc. Then at the end of the decade, 99, another sort of major war. Okay, US military today then. Let's take us into the 21st century. And picture that. We have of a drone. And again, until fairly recently, at least, one of the key features of American military power was its sort of technological lead over other countries. I think I'll just move on to the next slide. Obviously, this is a drone, so it's basically what we would describe in English as an unmanned aircraft, which can be sort of, hang on a minute. This was not the slide I wanted. Okay, I've got some questions there. Okay, hang on a minute. I think I uploaded the wrong slide. Should have checked it more closely. Yeah, I did. Okay, hang on. Apologise, hang on. Try this one. Okay, I think this is the... Okay, yeah, sorry, slightly different slide. It's got most of the main things that we mentioned, except first couple of slides talked a little bit about the Cold War. Which we don't need to worry too much, but so I don't think we've missed too much there. One thing worth noting, again, we talked a little bit about American military power. One thing I did sort of forget to mention, but nuclear weapons obviously is another thing that sort of separates the United States from other countries. Another sort of graph here, sort of showing. It shows global nuclear stockpiles. So this is all the world's nuclear weapons. And as we can see, the general trend in this period is from Second World War all the way up until about 1985. The general trend was for the world to have more and more nuclear weapons. It should be said that most of these weapons belonged to the Soviet Union and the United States. Obviously, other countries like China, Britain, and France had a few as well, but most, reaches about 70,000 nuclear weapons. As I say, the vast majority of those were in the hands of the two superpowers. And after 1985, and this is the result of the disarmament negotiations conducted by the United States and the Soviet Union, you saw a very sort of significant fall. Although that said, even even as late as 2010 or whatever it was, the world was still had about 20,000 nuclear weapons. So yeah, the United States obviously a nuclear power, as is Russia, China. These are the three you would say big. Just looking at the slide, yeah, I think I'm more or less at that. You have SALT 1972, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation talks conducted between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1972, treaties signed in 1972, and another one in 1979, which basically sort of limited the increase, established ceilings on the increase. But yeah, it's not until the 1980s where you have the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, so-called START, which basically leads to a reduction in nuclear weapons. Okay, right. We've already looked at these charts. Okay. Military power in the post-Cold War period. Again, I've already talked about this. But yeah, between 1990 and 2001, as I say, US deploys military forces on about 21 separate occasions. So as I say, although the 90s considered to be a reasonably peaceful decade, as I say, this is the post-Cold War period. The United States does use its military on several sort of overseas operations. The big one, as I said, beginning of the decade, is the war against Iraq in 1991. And yeah, the war was conducted according to what was known at the time as the Powell Doctrine, named after Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was a very senior military figure, a general. He later became George Bush Jr.'s Secretary of State. So he was basically in charge of American diplomacy during the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror afterwards. Anyway, the Powell Doctrine basically said that if America went to war, it should use, this is the fourth point there, overwhelming military power. And in part, this was a sort of reaction to Vietnam. One of the reasons why it was felt why America lost the war in Vietnam was simply because the United States fought a limited war there. That it felt constrained about the amount of military force it could actually apply against the Vietnamese. So Powell basically says, if we go to war again, we need overwhelming. We need to have lots and lots and lots of military force. It goes on to say there should be a clear objective. Again, this is a reaction to Vietnam, so you need to know exactly what it is you are fighting for, what you are going to achieve. And he also says there needs to be an exit strategy. So the fear was of being drawn into a long war. And Powell says, no, you need to know what you're fighting for, and above all else, you need to know how you are going to end the war, how you are actually going to withdraw. So yeah, the 91 military campaign against Iraq is conducted according to this criteria. And as I said, it results in a very, very clear, very decisive military victory. Kuwait is liberated, although of course Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi leader, remained in power. So there was an element, I suppose, of ambiguity in terms of victory there. Thereafter, for the next 10 years, Iraq becomes something of a problem on the international scene. No-fly zones were established in Iraq, which had to be policed by the United States and other international forces. And as part of the peace agreement at the end of the war, Saddam Hussein promised to dismantle all WMDs. These are weapons of mass destruction, so nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, things like that. And Saddam Hussein agreed that to allow United Nations inspectors to come into Iraq to actually check the status of these. And that becomes a long-running sort of dispute in the 1990s, with at various times Saddam Hussein forcing the inspectors out. There was a lot of diplomacy, international crisis, and as I say, that continues right the way through the decade until basically 2003 and the second war against Iraq. Okay, right, that brings us into the 21st century then. I'll say here the Bush administration, again, I should have made the slide a bit clearer. By Bush administration, I basically mean the second Bush. Okay, so this is the younger George Bush, who was president from 2001 to 2009. And of course, he is the president who is in office during the 9/11 attacks, and it is Bush who then goes on to launch the war on terror. Excuse me. Sorry, I was just looking at the slide. During the 2000 election campaign, Bush says he wanted a humble foreign policy. This is the first point on the slide here. So when he comes in, Bush gives the impression he's going to adopt a fairly isolationist policy in 2000. So it kind of indicates that he isn't going to have a very sort of activist foreign policy. He was, though, a Republican. The second point there, he certainly did believe that the United States needed to maintain a position of primacy. In other words, the United States needed to be with power, be much, much more stronger than other states. His Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, also wanted the United States to have a very high-tech military capability. And Bush also prioritizes missile defense. A key feature of Bush's foreign policy is this idea that the United States needed to have some kind of missile shield. Missile shields touch Rakitova. Okay. Then you have the sort of September 11th attacks, and that really sort of revolutionizes, I should say, American foreign policy. So almost overnight, Bush's approach to the world changes quite significantly, or at least I would say it changes quite significantly in terms of his attitude towards military intervention and the use of military power. So you have the attacks in New York and Washington. Bush immediately makes it clear that he is planning on finding whoever conducted the attacks and sort of rounding them up. So shortly after 9/11, about a month later, in October 2001, the United States intervenes in Afghanistan, which of course has since become America's longest war. So as I say, October 2001 is the beginning of America's involvement in Afghanistan, and they're still there today. I mean, Donald Trump is trying to sort of withdraw. He's trying to negotiate a peace settlement. But as I say, at the time, I think a lot of Americans would have been surprised had they known that this was the beginning of a very, very sort of long-term commitment. So almost 20 years later, and the United States still has, a lot of military forces deployed in the country. But initially, at least, the war in Afghanistan appeared to have been quite successful. The United States basically overruns the country. The Taliban government is sort of overthrown. A new government is established. Al-Qaeda's bases in Afghanistan are sort of overrun. A lot of prisoners are captured. So initially, as I say, the war seems to go pretty well. American forces, drive their way right into Kabul. And there's a slide notes the war in Afghanistan. In some ways, it's the most high-tech war that the United States conducts. It relies on a lot of high-tech weaponry, so things like precision-guided missiles, satellite communication. all sorts of stuff. And as I say, at the time, it seems to be pretty effective. Oh yeah, one other point I didn't make. 2002. So shortly after, um, you know, the United States has begun to be involved in Afghanistan. A new national security strategy is released, which reflects the new post 9/11 world, and it's a very interesting document. But one of the things that it makes clear is, as I say, this is the point below that, it emphasizes that it would prevent rogue states from developing weapons of mass destruction. It also says that it should be part of America's mission to promote democracy, particularly in the Middle East. So the Americans believe, part of this national security document basically says that it should be a key feature of America's national security strategy to try and promote democracy. The idea being that the more countries that were democratic in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, the more friendly they would be, the more friendly they would be towards the United States, or more likely they would be towards the United States. It's also clear in the national security strategy that Iraq is very much next on the list insofar as the United States is concerned. And this this sort of sets the scene for the Iraq War in 2003. So in 2002, 2003, essentially, again, I'm going to cut quite a long story short now. But essentially, the Bush administration insists that weapons inspectors need to be allowed into Iraq. They insist that Iraq's programs for developing weapons of mass destruction need to come to an end, need to be dismantled, and above all, there needs to be confirmation that these have come to an end. This leads to a lot of diplomacy in 2002. Ultimately, though, the Bush administration essentially says that Saddam Hussein had not abided by the provisions, and launches a war against Iraq. It's very controversial. A lot of people dispute the legality of the war against Iraq. The international community was deeply divided. Even some of America's allies in Europe were very much divided on the issue of the war. Countries like France and Germany, for example, come out in opposition to the war. Russia also opposed the intervention in Iraq. America goes ahead, launches the war in March 2003. And again, initially at least, it seems the war goes pretty well. The Iraqi army is more or less brushed aside by the US military. Baghdad is occupied. Saddam Hussein is deposed. He goes into hiding for a few months until he's eventually caught and brought to trial. So initially, the war in Iraq seems to go pretty well. However, once the war comes to an end, America finds itself having big problems when it comes to occupying the country and reconstructing it. And eventually, the United States finds itself battling a very an Iraqi insurgency. So it becomes very, very difficult for the United States to basically police the situation in Iraq. Furthermore, I say international community is divided on this. Some countries support the United States, others don't. What Iraq does show, though, again in 2003, is that the United States was capable of assembling this force, dispatching it to the other side of the world, overthrowing an authoritarian regime, and it was able to do so in the face of objections from other major countries. So in many ways, this was seen as a reflection, if you like, of America's status as being the world's most powerful military, of having the world's most powerful military. When it comes to it, there wasn't anything any other country could do to prevent this from happening. All right, so I thought I had another slide here. But I say, the problem is not just simply defeating the Iraqi military, but the problems really arise, as I say, from the occupation. America eventually sort of gets bogged down in this very sort of protracted war. And whereas in 2002, 2003, America is seen as being almost hegemonic in its position in world politics, by 2006, 2007, when the war was going badly, a lot of people are starting to talk about strategic overstretch. As I say on this slide, America finds that actually it's quite useful to have other countries assisting it. So America becomes a lot less unilateral. And a general feeling that the United States military is good at some things, such as fighting conventional wars, but it was finding it rather harder to, maintain order and occupy other countries. So both Iraq and also Afghanistan in later years sort of demonstrated, if you like, the limits of American power, limits of American military power. Okay, bring in Obama. So Obama obviously becomes president 2009, succeeds George Bush. During his campaign, Obama made it clear he certainly wanted to reduce the American military footprint in Iraq, which he did. So within a couple of years of coming to office, Obama saw a significant reduction in the American military presence. I should say this is quite an old slide, so I think I wrote it in about 2013. For some reason, I can't find a more up-to-date one. But yeah, as I say, Obama does sort of reduce the American military footprint. Initially, Obama wanted to devote more resources to Afghanistan, the idea being that he wanted to try and stabilize the situation in Afghanistan and then perhaps embark upon a sort of phased withdrawal from there. So Obama was certainly quite anxious to reduce America's footprint. The withdrawals from Iraq, though, became quite controversial later as a consequence of the rise of ISIS, so the Islamic State. And many people argued that Obama had been far too willing to had been far too quick to reduce America's military presence in Iraq, and that created the conditions, a sort of vacuum, if you like, in which the Islamic State, which had sort of morphed out of Al-Qaeda, but that created the conditions for the Islamic State to sort of move into. So having withdrawn from Iraq, the United States was then kind of sort of brought back into the region in order to try and deal, with the Islamic State. So Obama's policy there, proved to be, quite controversial. As I say, Obama did initially sort of intensify the war in Afghanistan, but with the view in the kind of longer term to try and stabilize the situation, as I say, and start reducing forces. Also, Obama, I didn't really talk much about this in the previous slide, but Obama, again, relied very, very heavily on American technology. The idea being that technology, to some extent, could reduce America's reliance on soldiers in the region. So American drones were a very sort of key, were an important feature, if I can put it that way, of America's presence within the region. So drone strikes against terrorists. And yeah, as I say, in some ways it was quite successful. Under Obama's presidency, I think it's fair to say, Al-Qaeda was significantly weakened. A lot of very high-profile Al-Qaeda leaders were killed as a consequence of this sort of campaign. That said, as I mentioned a moment ago, elements of Al Qaeda sort of morph into the Islamic State, so it's not a complete success. It's also the case that the drone strikes were very controversial. So, other countries were kind of worried that the Obama administration was using drones in a way that was morally and perhaps also legally quite dubious. Also created tensions with Pakistan because a lot of American drones were being used on the Afghanistan's frontier with Pakistan. And as I said, there were sort of doubts about the sort of legality of the war. One thing I didn't really stress much earlier is about, as I said, the high-tech aspect of the American military. I mean, a lot of writers have talked about this idea of a revolution in military affairs. This idea that the nature of warfare itself has been transformed by technology. And certainly, again, in the 2000s, early 2010s, if I can put it that way, America was thought to have quite a decisive lead in this sort of technology. Since then, as the article I sent you suggests, other countries are sort of catching up. China especially is becoming, its military is becoming increasingly high tech. So again, as I say, a lot of people are talking about about a sort of possible slippage there. Just trying to think what's on the last slide. Okay, that's just the conclusions, right? Okay, I'll just a couple of points, and I'll quickly talk about Trump, and then I'll bring this to an end. As we won't be using the full 90 minutes today. One or two quick observations, and maybe I'll try and update the PowerPoint and send this to you, or find a more recent PowerPoint and send it to you. I think technology has also America's dominance in the technological sphere is sort of changing in other areas. Again, I read another article not that long ago, which was talking about the fact that China now has sort of weapons which it could conceivably use against the United States Navy. So whereas the US Navy has been pretty much had superiority in all the world's oceans since the Second World War, especially in the Pacific. American warships have been able to sail without being seriously challenged. That, it seems, is also coming to an end. As I say, China now has sort of weapons, missiles, things like that, which basically could do serious damage to the United States Navy if a war broke out. So America no longer has this sort of free rite of passage. So it no longer has naval supremacy in the way that it wants to. So yeah, as I say, technology seems to suggest that American military supremacy is no longer quite as strong as it once was a few years ago. And as I say, China especially is becoming a significant strategic competitor of the United States in that area. Quick couple of things to say about Trump. I think it's hard to kind of see much of a coherent strategy in terms of the Trump administration's foreign policy. The one thing Trump has been pretty consistent on, though, long before he even became president, was that his own feeling is that America's military should not be too actively engaged overseas. So, Trump was quite critical of Iraq and Afghanistan, or at least the long-term deployment of American troops, of American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. So Trump's inclination is not to send American forces overseas. To some extent, that was reflected a few months ago when he withdrew American forces out, a sizable number of American forces out of Syria, which again was quite controversial, but it sort of reflected this view. On the other hand, Trump as president has been willing to launch operations. Recently, you had Trump's decision to assassinate an Iranian general, which again was very controversial, created an international crisis, although it sort of seems to have partially stabilized now. So on the one hand, yeah, as I say, you've got this sort of contradiction in Trump's policy. On the one hand, as I say, wanting to sort of reduce America's military presence overseas. On the other hand, there's certainly been occasions when he's been willing to launch American attacks. So, as I say, in some sense, it's hard to devise a very sort of coherent strategy. In terms of Iran, Trump came out against the nuclear deal that the Obama administration negotiated. Trump was not happy with the agreement that the United States and the Europeans had negotiated with Iran in order to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. So he's withdrawn from that. And that has sort of created a sort of crisis relationship with Iran. So in general, I mean, in terms of Trump's views on military power, I think he is pretty unilateralist in the sense that he's willing to take individual decisions to use military force, but also, as I say, his inclination is to sort of reduce America's military presence overseas. All right, reach the final slide and then I'll finish for today. So yeah, US military conclusion. Yeah, US military technology allows for decisive battlefield victories. Yeah, I mean, I wrote this a few years ago. So as I say, I think that perhaps is beginning to change. Both Taliban, Saddam Hussein were easily overthrown in America's sort of military interventions against them. So that did seem to result in, pretty clear military victories. However, in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States found it very hard to maintain a sort of long-term kind of occupying presence. American manpower meaning soldiers, has been sort of stretched. So America's found it difficult to maintain the sort of military presence there. And yeah, still little political appetite for long-term military commitments. I mean, I think this is true of Trump and to some degree with Obama as well. America's been willing to launch operations, but it's been, altogether less willing to sustain a long-term presence. Both Obama and now Trump have been looking to, as I say, sort of reduce America's sort of overseas. And the final point which I would add to that, which as I said relates to the newspaper article, is that America's sort of technological lead disappearing. Okay, so yeah, as I say, yeah, sorry, that was a slightly old slide. Probably I've got a newer one somewhere which I can send to you, which will update some of the things that appear on this one. Is there any questions or anybody want to make a comment or come through? We're not getting anything. Okay, right. Okay. Yeah, that's probably it for today. Okay. What I might do is perhaps I will just kind of upload a couple of videos as well onto YouTube for some of the other classes. As I say, I'll try and find some more up-to-date PowerPoints. I'm not quite sure. My laptop collapsed a couple of months ago, and it looks like the files I put onto this one aren't the most up to date. So I'll try. I'm pretty sure I've got some newer versions somewhere, so I'll try and find them. Okay, right. Well, I think that's it for today. I would suggest you to have a little read of the newspaper article that I sent you on the US military. There's a question there for you to think about as well. Other than that, I think we will finish there. I can stay online for a bit longer if anybody's got any questions or anything. If not, though, you are welcome to log off now. So thanks a lot. And I will see you next week.